So sort of the history of the disagreement over the Parrot between the state and EPA kind of goes back probably to the early 2000s, and the EPA had decided that they didn't believe they could clean up the Parrot and other wastes along the MSD corridor to the point where they could restore the aquifer to a usable state. And so they decided that they would need to waive the standards that are usually applied to the aquifer. And that is called, it's a process called a technical impracticability evaluation. And so they went along and they said, we can't clean up the aquifer, so we're just going to write off standards, and then we will make sure that we can manage this water so that it won't affect people and it won't affect Silverbow Creek. And the way they would manage the part about people not being affected is an institutional control. So they'll say, we'll keep people from drinking this water. And so there is a program where they would actually, where the city says you can't drill any more wells in citywide. If you can hook up to city water, you're required to hook up to city water. So that's one of the protections. As far as the creek goes, it's a whole system that says we don't think that the groundwater plume under the Parrot is moving, and we think we can capture all of that water and we can treat all of that water. Again, this Butte lagoon system, the Butte treatment lagoons that you see behind me, has been a very effective treatment system. The question still comes down to, can they capture it all? And is the Parrot plume, the Parrot groundwater plume, still continuing to advance? Is it an active plume? They're really questions that have been a long scientific debate between EPA and the state. More recent studies have shown that the Parrot plume extends all the way from the Civic Center to the KOA, down somewhat through the old Silverbow Creek corridor, which is now the MSD corridor. The original studies that EPA based their final decision to leave these wastes in place has since been shown by more recent studies to be substantially flawed. Whereas originally they said that the aquifer was just composed of a bunch of little components of sands, gravels, and clays, and that not much water was moving through the aquifer, and that most of it was in the upper part of the aquifer. Recent studies have shown that that was not the case, and that actually water was moving 100 times faster than the original studies, and that the most important part of this contamination flow was found in a deeper portion of the aquifer. We now call that the middle alluvial unit, kind of a technical term. The other important part to keep in mind is also a debate over whether the groundwater is being completely captured by the subdrain system that underlies the MSD channel. If it's not, then over the long term, and if the plume is advancing, it will start to show up in Silverbow Creek in the long term. So for the present time, the cleanup and the capture of that groundwater has been fairly successful. The real question comes down to a real long term. And when you're talking groundwater and you're talking about leaving wastes in place, especially as significant as the Parrot tailings are to the aquifer system, then you really need to have a better view to the long-term future. None of us has a very good crystal ball. It really comes down to a matter of the uncertainties involved in whether the plume is moving and whether the entire plume can be captured. And the state is not willing to gamble on our long-term future of Silverbow Creek, because in the long term, if Atlantic Richfield is no longer around to pay for the cleanup and we find it's a problem, it will be the state that'll be picking up the bill.